This week we're going to make a very important shift from asexual propagation, which is basically every propagation technique we've talked about up to this point, to sexual propagation, starting with seed formation. So we'll cover seed formation and plant breeding in this unit, and then going on from that we'll discuss seed germination, seed dormancy, and that sort of thing. So, where do seeds come from? Well, they start as flowers, of course, and this diagram should not be new information to you. This is information that we covered at the very beginning of the semester when we were talking about plant anatomy, and we discussed the parts of the flower. Now, it's not important to me that you remember every single thing on this page, but you should know most of it. I would want you to know that the stamen is the male reproductive organ, the pistil is the female reproductive organ, and the parts of both of those. In addition, I would want you to know the other two of the four whorls. So we have the stamen, the pistil. I also expect you to know the petal and the sepals. So just a brief review for you here on parts of the flowers. Make sure you remember the definitions of these terms. And with that, we're going to move on to the whole process of seed formation, starting with the flower. So, within the stamen and the pistil, specifically in the anthers of the stamens and in the ovules of the pistil, we have a process of cell division occurring called meiosis. Now you'll recall we also discussed mitosis and meiosis in the plant anatomy lecture at the beginning of the semester. Meiosis is the type of cell division that yields daughter cells that are not genetically identical to the parent cell. And this is very important when we're talking about sexual propagation, because remember that sexual propagation gives us daughter plants that aren't genetically identical to the parent plant. So it makes sense that the cell division is following that pattern. So meiosis is going to occur in the flower during the bud stage, so before the flower even opens, and it results in those daughter cells, which we refer to as haploid daughter cells. The reason why we call them that is not only are they genetically different from the parent cells in their genetic makeup, but also in the quantity of genetic material in those cells. So when meiosis occurs, we end up with daughter cells that have half the genetic material of the parent cells, so they're haploid cells. The parent cell we refer to as a diploid cell. It has 2 copies of all the chromosomes. Haploid daughter cells have 1 copy of all the chromosomes. So a term for these daughter cells of meiosis is gamete, and gamete is just a haploid sex cell. So in plants we have pollen cells, which are gametes, and also egg cells in the ovules of the ovary, and those are our gametes. We'll talk about this again when we talk about sexual propagation of ferns, because ferns are a little bit different. And here's just a comparison again of mitosis and meiosis to refresh your memory. Mitosis on the left, you see that we end up with 2 daughter cells that are genetically identical both in makeup and quantity of genetic material as the parent plant. With meiosis, again, we have more daughter cells than we get with mitosis, and they're genetically different from the parent cell both in makeup and quantity. Right, so meiosis happens in that flower bud, in the anthers, and in the ovules before the flower even opens. And then once that flower opens, the first thing that happens in the whole process of sexual propagation from this point on is pollination. And pollination is just defined as the transfer of the pollen to the female organ. So it's not anything that happens after that, it's just those pollen grains landing on the stigma of the pistil. That's how it happens in angiosperms. Gymnosperms don't have pistils, they don't have stamens, they just have cones. So in gymnosperms, pollination happens when the pollen moves from the male cone to the ovule of the female cone. If you're thinking to yourself, what do male and female cones look like? Just think about pine trees. And if you're in North Carolina around this time of year, which is the beginning of April, you're thinking about pine trees because pine pollen is everywhere. And that's coming off of those male cones, those small yellowish green things that appear. They sort of look like small fingers on the pine trees that release the pollen. That's the male cones. And then the female cones are what you typically think of as a traditional pine cone, the brown spiny things. Now pollination whether it's in gymnosperms or angiosperms, is not the same as fertilization. Just because something gets pollinated doesn't mean it's going to be fertilized. And here's what I'm talking about. First of all, in order for fertilization to follow pollination, the plants have to be compatible. I just said that this is the time of year in North Carolina where the pine trees go nuts, and they just release pollen all over the place. That pine tree pollen is going to fall on a lot of plants. It's going to fall on other pine trees, and fertilization might happen then, but it's also going to fall on anything else blooming this time of year, such as daffodils and tulips. And just because pine pollen falls on your tulips doesn't mean you're going to get some sort of pine tulip hybrid, although that would be kind of awesome. No, they're not compatible, so pollination happens, the pollen does transfer to the pistil of that tulip, but fertilization doesn't happen. Also, just because pollination happens and the plants are compatible doesn't mean fertilization will happen immediately. The time frame varies with species, and I've given you a few examples here. So cucurbits, which is your first example, cucurbits include things like cucumbers and watermelons. It's going to take 26 to 40 hours for fertilization to occur after the pollen first lands on the pistil. With apples, we have 9 to 120 hours. That's a pretty wide range, but that has to do with what cultivar and type of apple it is. For a lot of our larger woody plants, it can take even longer. So for birch, it takes a month. For an oak, it takes a year. That means that pollen released by oaks this spring will land on the female oak flower, and then it will take a whole year for that pollen to travel down the style into the ovary to fertilize the egg cells in the ovules. So the acorns that you see in the fall, those are the result of over a year's worth process. So what happens in fertilization exactly? We've talked about what pollination is and that it's not fertilization. We've talked about when fertilization doesn't follow pollination, but what exactly happens? Well, after that pollen grain lands on the stigma of the pistil, it's going to grow a pollen tube down the style and into the ovary of the plant. Now, what will happen next are 2 sperm nuclei, so basically 2 packages of genetic material from the pollen are going to move down that tube into the ovary, and one of those packages of genetic material from the pollen is going to fuse with the egg cell. And so you have the fusion of male and female gametes, the sperm nuclei from the pollen and the egg in the ovule, to form a diploid cell, so now something with 2 copies of the chromosomes, and that's called the zygote. Now the zygote is going to be our baby plant. In angiosperms, and only in angiosperms, we have what's called double fertilization. So you have the pollen cell plus the egg cell yielding that diploid zygote, which is the baby plant. But remember I said 2 packages of genetic material move down that pollen tube. The second one is going to fuse with 2 polar nuclei in the ovule. These are 2 more envelopes of genetic material, but these ones are from the mother plant, not the father plant, which gives us the pollen. So when those fuse, we get a triploid cell. This is a cell with 3 copies of the chromosomes, and that's the endosperm. And what that's going to become is sort of a food source for the developing zygote as it grows into a baby plant. All right, so we have 2 fusion events. One of the pollen cells fuses with the egg cell, and the other pollen cell fuses with the 2 polar nuclei. One of those fusion events creates the baby plant, and the other one yields the endosperm, or that food tissue for the baby plant. This diagram shows an example of what structures are called in the flower before fertilization and what they are later called in the fruit after fertilization, because fertilization is what makes fruit form. You have your flower, it gets pollinated, and then as soon as fertilization happens, that flower, the petals and the sepals often fall off, and what develops is the fruit with the seeds inside. So, for example, the ovary of the pistil in the flower, that whole thing, after fertilization becomes the fruit, and each ovule in the ovary becomes a seed. Now, it's not all that important to me that you remember that the embryo sac forms the inner seed, or that the integuments form the seed coat. But I do want you again to remember that those polar nuclei after fertilization, after fusion with the pollen cell, become the endosperm, and then the egg cell after fusion with the pollen cell becomes the embryo. Now you may be thinking, whoa, I thought it was the zygote. Just making sure you're paying attention. The single cell that forms, that diploid cell that forms when the egg and pollen fuse together, is the zygote. Once cell division by mitosis this time starts to happen and it has more than one cell, that baby plant is called the embryo. And so here is what we have in our seed. The seed has three major parts that we care about: the embryo, the endosperm, which is again that tissue that provides nutrition for the embryo, and then the seed coat, which protects it. We'll talk a lot about the seed coat next week when we're talking about seed dormancy. Now, I've told you that seed propagation is sexual, and that's true. It is sexual propagation. But every once in a while, we have these special situations where we actually get seed developing asexually. So this is not the norm, but it is something that happens, and so I want you to be familiar with that concept. So there's a couple of situations where this happens. The first one is called apomixis. And what happens with apomixis is we have the production of an embryo, a baby plant within a seed, without fertilization. So the plant just spontaneously forms seeds with embryos inside without fertilization occurring. And so what happens is when you plant those seeds, they will actually be clonal offspring of the mother plant. This is good if you're trying to propagate uniform plants because you get the ease and convenience of seed propagation, but with the uniformity of asexual propagation. It's bad if you're trying to breed a new plant because you're not getting a lot of genetic diversity. So that's apomixis, and one example of a plant that does apomixis is the one pictured here, dandelions. They are very apomictic. They produce apomictic seed or asexual seed all the time. The second term there, polyembryony, is when you actually have multiple embryos developing in the same seed. So usually you just have one embryo per seed, one baby plant per seed. Here we have multiple embryos per seed. And usually, in this case, one of those embryos did form after fertilization sexually like a normal seed embryo. And then all the other ones form spontaneously asexually. So it's as if you had apomixis and sexual embryo production in the same seed. And this happens sometimes in oranges. And then finally we have parthenocarpy. Parthenocarpy is fruit development without pollination or fertilization. So not seed development, just fruit development. Parthenocarpy, as you might guess from the picture here, is actually something desirable for fruit production because, particularly in America, we are lazy and we do not want to have to get the seeds out of our fruit. Much better to just have fruit that produce no seed. And so seedless watermelons are an example of this. However, they're a little bit tricky. They do still have to be pollinated to stimulate the fruit production to sort of signal to the plant to produce parthenocarpic fruit, but fertilization never happens. So they get pollinated but not fertilized, and so what happens is parthenocarpy. The watermelon fruit develops without seeds. So with that, we will end our discussion of seed formation. The rest of the material for this week is on ornamental plant breeding.